Welcome back. Today we're diving into a story more poignant, more achingly real than any tear-stained country ballad ever penned. It's a narrative woven from threads of astonishing talent, dizzying fame, and the very genesis of a legendary musical movement. But peel back the layers of platinum records and industry revolution, and you find a raw human tragedy at its core. It's a story about brotherhood, about the seemingly unbreakable bonds forged in blood and harmony, bonds that were ultimately devastatingly torn apart by the very spotlight they chased together. They were the Glaser Brothers, Tompall, Chuck, and Jim, three farm boys from the heartland of Nebraska who descended upon Nashville, armed with harmonies so unique, so captivating, they were hailed almost inevitably as the country Beatles. They weren't just singers, they were architects, the quiet geniuses behind the scenes who helped birth the defiant roar of outlaw country, building a sanctuary called Hillbilly Central, where legends like Waylon Jennings found their true voice. They reached the summit, gazed out over the kingdom they helped create, and then they fell. Not felled by external forces, but by the insidious corrosion from within, disputes over credit, clashes over money, and the suffocating shadow cast by the most dominant among them, Tompall. By the time the dust settled in the late 1970s, the magical harmony was gone, replaced by bitter silence. They split in 1973, but reunited from 1979 to 1982, releasing two Elektra albums. Their 1981 single, Lovin' Her Was Easier, reached number 2 on the Billboard Country chart. This is the story of the brothers who built Outlaw Country and then tore each other apart. The soaring harmonies and eventual bitter discord of the Glaser Brothers trace their roots not to the neon glow of Nashville, but far away from it. Our journey begins not on the hallowed stage of the Grand Ole Opry, but amidst the stark, expansive beauty of rural Nebraska during the Great Depression and the war years that followed. Spalding, Nebraska, nestled in the Loup Valley. This wasn't Music City. This was farm country, hard country, a land shaped by endless fields of corn, the rhythm of the seasons, demanding physical labor, and the quiet resilience of families wrestling a living from the soil. It was a place where community ties were strong, forged in shared hardship and simple pleasures, and where music, often homemade, was not a commodity, but a lifeline, an essential thread in the fabric of daily existence. Harold Franklin Tompall Glaser, the eldest, entered this world in 1933, followed by Charles Vernon Chuck in 1936, and finally James William Jim in 1937. Their parents, Henry and Mary Glaser, were quintessential figures of the heartland. Henry was a stern, hard-working farmer, raising corn and hogs, a man whose hands knew the feel of earth and tools far better than the fretboard of a guitar, though he did play mandolin and harmonica with unpretentious skill. Mary was the anchor, the nurturing force who managed the household through lean times and crucially fostered the musical seeds already evident in her sons. Life on the Glaser farm was defined by chores started before dawn, the cyclical demands of planting and harvest, and the omnipresent backdrop of economic uncertainty that lingered long after the worst of the Depression had passed. Entertainment wasn't bought, it was made. In this environment, music wasn't a pursuit of fame. It was an integral part of family life, a shared language, spoken around the dinner table or on the porch after a long day's work. The Glaser household resonated with sound. Henry's mandolin, Mary's guitar, and most importantly, the voices. Singing together was as natural as breathing. They absorbed the sounds around them. The hymns sung in the local church, the Grand Ole Opry, broadcasts crackling over the battery-powered radio on Saturday nights, the cowboy songs, the folk tunes carried on the wind across the plains. It was a rich, unvarnished tapestry of American roots music, and the Glaser boys soaked it all in. From the earliest age, their innate musicality was undeniable. They weren't just mimicking, they were harmonizing, instinctively finding the notes that complemented each other, creating a sound bigger than the sum of its parts. Tompall, even as a boy, possessed a natural authority and an outgoing nature. He was the leader, the organizer, the one pushing the others. Chuck, quieter and more introspective, developed a smooth, reliable vocal anchor. And Jim, the youngest, blessed with a soaring tenor voice and an early flair for songwriting, quickly emerged as a standout talent, though perhaps the most sensitive of the trio. Their harmony wasn't something learned from a book or a teacher. It was organic, intuitive, honed through countless hours spent singing together simply for the joy of it. There's a particular magic that often exists in sibling harmony, a shared timbre, an almost telepathic understanding of phrasing and intonation that outsiders can rarely replicate. The Everly Brothers had it. The Louvin Brothers had it. And the Glaser Brothers possessed it in abundance. Their blend was unique even then, not the tight, high, lonesome sound of bluegrass, nor the smooth, polished sound of burgeoning pop. It had a rougher edge, a bluesy inflection picked up perhaps from those late-night radio waves carrying sounds from distant cities, a hint of jazz timing, and an emotional honesty rooted in their rural experience. They could weave intricate vocal lines, anticipate each other's moves, creating a complex yet seamless wall of sound that was utterly captivating. Local folks noticed. They began playing at barn dances, county fairs, church socials, anywhere people gathered. They were the Glaser Brothers from Spalding, those farm boys who could really sing. But as the boys grew into young men in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the confines of Spalding began to feel too small. The world outside beckoned, carried on the airwaves by voices like Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzell, and Ernest Tubb. Nashville wasn't just a city on a map, it was Oz, the emerald city of country music, the place where dreams were spun into gold records. The lure was irresistible. They knew with the certainty of youth that their destiny lay not in the cornfields, but under the stage lights of the Grand Ole Opry. The journey wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. There were detours. Tompall served a stint in the Army. They played locally, building a regional reputation. They even had a brief unsuccessful brush with a major label, Decca, in the late 50s, recording under the name The Glaser Brothers, featuring Tompall. The records went nowhere, a harsh introduction to the realities of the music business. But the dream didn't die. If anything, the setbacks solidified their resolve, particularly Tompall's. He was the driving force, the one who refused to settle for a life defined by the horizon line of Nebraska. Finally, in the late 1950s, they made the definitive move. Pooling their meager resources, they packed their bags and headed south, joining the hopeful throng flocking to Nashville. They arrived in a city that was itself in transition. The raw honky-tonk sound of the early 50s was beginning to yield to something smoother, more orchestrated. The nascent Nashville sound, pioneered by producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley. It was an attempt to make country music more palatable to a wider pop-oriented audience, smoothing out the rough edges, adding strings and background choruses. It was a time of immense opportunity, but also intense competition. For three young men from Nebraska with a unique, slightly unconventional harmony style, breaking in was a formidable challenge. Nashville was teeming with talent, all vying for the same limited spots on radio shows, recording sessions, and the ultimate prize, the Opry stage. The Glaser sound didn't neatly fit the emerging mold. It was too country for pop, perhaps a bit too complex or Western, sounding for the mainstream Nashville producers. They weren't polished. They still carried the dust of the plains in their voices. Tompall, ever the hustler, took the lead. He worked tirelessly, networking, playing gigs in rough-and-tumble honky-tonks on Lower Broadway for little pay, taking any session work they could get, often just to put food on the table. Chuck and Jim followed, honing their skills, writing songs, and learning the intricate, often frustrating politics of Music Row. These were lean, character-building years. They faced rejection, financial hardship, and the constant gnawing doubt that maybe their Nebraska sound just wasn't meant for the big time. One apocryphal story tells of them being so broke they considered pawning their instruments, only holding back at the last minute. Whether strictly true or not, it captures the desperation of those early days. Their persistence, however, began to pay off, not initially as frontline artists, but through the side door, the world of session singing. Their unique harmony blend, the very thing that made them hard to categorize as lead artists, was a godsend in the studio. Producers started noticing their uncanny ability to instantly create rich, distinctive background vocals that could elevate any track. Their break came incrementally. They started getting calls, a session here for an up-and-coming singer, a jingle there for a local business. Word spread about the Glaser Brothers' incredible ear for harmony and their professionalism in the studio. Then came the bigger names. On El Paso, the harmony vocals are by Bobby Sykes and Jim Glaser, not the full trio as a credited group. Hearing their voices woven into such massive hits gave them invaluable exposure and credibility. Soon, the calls were pouring in. Johnny Cash used them. Patsy Cline featured their backing on some tracks. Bobby Bare, Skeeter Davis, Roy Orbison. The list grew longer and more impressive. If you listen closely to countless country hits from the late 1950s and early 1960s, you can often discern the unmistakable Glaser harmony weaving through the background, adding that extra layer of soul and polish. They became Nashville's secret weapon, the go-to guys for perfect harmonies, delivered quickly and flawlessly. This period was crucial for their development. While frustrating not to be the stars themselves, the intense studio work sharpened their skills to a razor's edge. They learned microphone technique, arrangement tricks, and the art of blending their voices under pressure. They observed the best producers, songwriters, and musicians in the business, absorbing knowledge like sponges. They were, in effect, getting a master class in record making, paid for by the hour. It was during this time, amidst the whirlwind of session work, that the Country Beatles nickname emerged. It's hard to pinpoint exactly who said it first, but it stuck, likely originating from fellow musicians or industry insiders awestruck by their vocal prowess and their seemingly ubiquitous presence on hit records. While stylistically worlds apart from the Fab Four, the comparison spoke volumes about the impact and perceived uniqueness of their harmony sound within the Nashville context. They were seen as innovators, bringing something fresh and exciting to the established formulas. Their success as session singers inevitably led to renewed interest in them as recording artists in their own right. Producer Paul Cohen signed them to Cap Records, and later they moved to MGM under the guidance of legendary producer Jim Viano. This time, armed with years of experience and a growing reputation, things started to click. They began releasing singles under their own name again, showcasing their refined harmony blend and Jim Glaser's increasingly sophisticated songwriting. While major chart dominance still eluded them initially, they were building a dedicated following and earning the respect of their peers. not just as backup singers, but as artists with a unique vision. One pivotal moment came through their association with another rising star, someone who would become inextricably linked with their story, Waylon Jennings. Waylon, a protege of Buddy Holly, was struggling to fit into the polished Nashville mold. He recognized a kindred spirit in the Glazers, particularly in Tompall's independent streak. They began collaborating, with the Glazers providing stunning background vocals on Waylon's early Nashville recordings. This friendship would prove crucial, laying the groundwork for the Outlaw Revolution that was just around the corner. The early 1960s, therefore, represented a period of transition and growth for the Glaser Brothers. They had survived the initial struggles, paid their dues in the trenches of the session world, and were finally beginning to emerge as respected artists. They had honed their unique sound, built crucial industry connections, and developed a reputation for professionalism and innovation. They were no longer just farm boys from Nebraska. They were seasoned Nashville veterans, poised on the brink of something much bigger. The stage was set, not just for their own stardom, but for them to become unlikely catalysts for a rebellion that would shake the foundations of Music City. Their harmony was perfect. Their ambition burned bright, but hidden beneath the surface, the first subtle strains of discord were already being composed, waiting for the pressures of fame to bring them to a crashing crescendo. The Glaser Brothers had paid their dues. Their harmonies echoed on countless hits, their reputation cemented within the Nashville elite. They stood at the threshold, ready to claim their own spotlight. This climb to the top, the realization of their Nashville dream, would lead directly to the creation of Hillbilly Central. This unlikely headquarters of the Outlaw Revolution was where Tompall Glaser, alongside Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, became an architect of country music's most significant rebellion. Yet even as they reached the pinnacle, the seeds of their own destruction were being sown. Success would bring not just rewards, but resentment, rivalry, and the first cracks in the foundation of their brotherhood. By the mid-1960s, the Glaser Brothers were no longer Nashville outsiders pleading for a chance. They were integral cogs in the Music City machine, their voices the sonic glue holding together countless hits. Their harmony was a recognized, respected commodity. But for men driven by the fierce ambition forged on those Nebraska plains, being the indispensable background was never going to be enough. Tompall, Chuck, and Jim yearned for the center stage, for their own names on the records, for the recognition that their unique talent truly deserved. The session work had been a necessary apprenticeship, a masterclass in the craft. But now it was time to graduate. It was time for the Glaser Brothers to become stars in their own right, and perhaps more significantly, to become masters of their own destiny in a town notorious for controlling its artists. Their transition wasn't instantaneous. Moving from sought-after session singers to headlining artists required navigating the complex currents of record label politics and finding the right material to showcase their distinct sound. They continued recording for MGM Records, working with producers who understood their strengths, but also operated within the confines of the prevailing Nashville sound. While this sound, characterized by smooth vocals, lush string arrangements, and pop sensibilities, was commercially successful, it often felt like an ill-fitting suit for the Glazers' earthier, more complex harmonies. There was a constant push and pull between their artistic instincts and the commercial demands of the era. Despite these tensions, their talent was undeniable, and hits began to surface. Their rendition of John D. Loudermilk's Gone, on the other hand, in 1966 showed promise, cracking the top 30. but it was their interpretation of songs that blended country roots with a contemporary, almost folk rock feel that truly began to define their emerging solo identity. In 1969, they released California Girl, written by Harlan Howard. The song, with its gentle rhythm, evocative lyrics about cultural clashes, and of course the signature Glaser harmony, became their first significant top 10 hit. It captured a certain zeitgeist, reflecting the migrations and cultural shifts happening in America, all wrapped in their warm, instantly recognizable sound. This wasn't just background harmony anymore. This was the Glaser Brothers' voice, front and center. The momentum continued to build. They became regulars on syndicated country music television shows like The Porter Wagoner Show and Hee Haw. Their polished yet authentic stage presence winning over audiences nationwide. They toured extensively, moving beyond the honky-tonks to larger venues, sharing bills with the very stars they had previously backed. They were finally experiencing the fruits of their long labor, the applause, the recognition, the sense that they had truly arrived. Then, in 1971, came the song that cemented their status, Rings. Written by Eddie Reeves and Alex Harvey, it was a perfectly crafted piece of country pop storytelling, a poignant narrative about pawned wedding rings and enduring love. The Glazers' intricate harmonies elevated the song, giving it an emotional depth and resonance that struck a chord with listeners. Rings soared up the charts, reaching the top 10 on the country charts and even crossing over to the pop charts, a significant achievement for a country act at the time. It became their signature song, the track most associated with their name as performers. For a moment, it seemed the Glaser Brothers had found the perfect formula, balancing their unique harmony style with commercial appeal. They were bona fide stars. But even as they climbed the charts under their own name, a deeper, more rebellious current was flowing through Nashville, and the Glaser Brothers, particularly Tompall, were right at its epicenter. The polished Nashville sound, while commercially successful, was breeding discontent among a generation of artists who felt creatively stifled. They chafed under the control of producers who dictated what they sang, how they sang it, and who played on their records. They yearned for the raw energy of live performance, for the freedom to record with their own road bands, for the artistic integrity they felt was being sacrificed on the altar of crossover appeal. This simmering frustration needed a place to boil over, a sanctuary where the rules didn't apply. Tompall Glaser decided to build one. In a move that was both audacious and visionary, the Glaser Brothers, flush with their growing success and publishing income, decided to invest in their independence. Around 1969 to 1970, they purchased a modest, slightly dilapidated two-story house at 916 19th Avenue South, right in the heart of the burgeoning Music Row district. It wasn't glamorous. It was just down the street from RCA's legendary Studio B, but worlds away in atmosphere. They gutted it, installed recording equipment, not state-of-the-art by RCA standards, but functional, and crucially theirs, and christened it Glaser Sound Studios, though it quickly acquired a more evocative nickname, Hillbilly Central. Hillbilly Central wasn't just a recording studio. It was a clubhouse, a laboratory, a speakeasy, a declaration of independence. It became the physical and spiritual home of the burgeoning outlaw movement. The atmosphere was deliberately anti-establishment. The doors were always open, the beer flowed freely, and the clock seemed irrelevant. Recording sessions could start late, run all night, fueled by creative energy, camaraderie, and often various other substances. It was a haven for artists who felt like misfits within the polished confines of the established Nashville studios. Here, they could experiment, make noise, make mistakes, and most importantly, make music on their own terms. free from the hovering presence of label executives in suits. Tompall Glaser was the undeniable ringleader, the presiding spirit of Hillbilly Central. His office, famously cluttered and chaotic, became the movement's unofficial headquarters. He was more than just a studio owner. He was a facilitator, a producer, a sounding board, and a fierce advocate for artistic freedom. His belief was simple: trust the artist. Let them record with their own bands, the musicians who understood their sound intimately from countless nights on the road. Let them choose their own songs, even if they were unconventional. Let them capture the raw energy of their live shows, rather than sterilizing it with strings and background choirs. It sounds obvious now, but in the highly controlled Nashville of the early 1970s, it was revolutionary. And the Outlaws Lapine. Yesterday's Wine was recorded at RCA Studio B, not at Glaser Sound. Chris Christopherson, the Rhodes Scholar turned songwriter, whose poetic, gritty lyrics were shaking up the establishment, was a frequent visitor. Songwriters like Shel Silverstein and Mickey Newbury found a space where their unconventional ideas were welcomed. Kinky Friedman and his Texas Jew Boys brought their own brand of irreverent chaos to the studio. It was a melting pot of creativity, fueled by a shared desire to break the mold. But perhaps the most significant relationship forged within the walls of Hillbilly Central was between Tompall Glaser and Waylon Jennings. Waylon, signed to RCA, was deeply frustrated. He was a powerful live performer with a raw rock-influenced sound, but his producers, Chet Atkins included, were trying to mold him into a smoother, more conventional country singer. Waylon felt like a puppet, forced to record songs he disliked with session musicians he didn't connect with. He was on the verge of quitting Nashville altogether. Tompall Glaser became Waylon's champion, his co-conspirator. He understood Waylon's frustration implicitly. He saw the potential for greatness being stifled. Tompall essentially told Waylon, record the music you want to record, how you want to record it, with your band right here at Hillbilly Central. Forget RCA's rules. This defiant attitude was exactly what Waylon needed to hear. The sessions that followed were legendary, albeit often tense and fraught with creative friction. Both Waylon and Tompall possessed strong, stubborn personalities. Working outside the official RCA studios, Waylon, with Tompall acting as producer, mentor, and fellow outlaw, finally captured the sound that had been burning inside him. They stripped away the strings, brought in Waylon's road band, the Wailers, and recorded tracks that were raw, powerful, and undeniably Waylon. Albums like Honky Tonk Heroes, largely recorded or inspired by the Hillbilly Central ethos, became cornerstones of the outlaw movement. Waylon finally sounded like himself, and Tompall Glaser had been the crucial catalyst. He hadn't just provided a studio, he had provided the permission, the encouragement, and the creative space for Waylon to become the legend he was destined to be. While Waylon rightly gets the credit for his artistry, Tompall's role as the midwife to the definitive outlaw sound cannot be overstated. He wasn't just facilitating, he was actively shaping the rebellion. While Tompall was busy fomenting revolution at Hillbilly Central, the Glaser Brothers as a performing unit were also reaching new heights, benefiting from the reflected glow of the outlaw movement and Tompall's increasing prominence. Charlie is a Tompall solo LP on MGM, not a Glaser Brothers Elektra release, and there is no Glaser Brothers album titled Vorsicht. The trio's Elektra period is the 1979 to 1982 reunion, including the 1981 LP Lovin' Her Was Easier. The Outlaws is a compilation featuring Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, Jesse Coulter, and Tompall Glaser. The trio's harmonies are not a featured element of that album. They were riding the crest of the wave they had helped create. They had achieved critical acclaim, commercial success, and artistic relevance. From the outside, it looked like they had finally conquered Nashville on their own terms. But the intoxicating brew of fame, creative control, and revolutionary fervor that defined the Hillbilly Central era also contained the seeds of the Glaser Brothers' own undoing. Success, paradoxically, began to expose and exacerbate the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect harmony. The very forces that propelled them to the top would soon conspire to tear them apart. The most significant and unavoidable issue was the growing imbalance of power and recognition within the trio. Tompall, undeniably, was the star. His personality was bigger, his voice often took the lead on stage and in interviews, and his role as the figurehead of Hillbilly Central and a certified outlaw cast a long shadow. He was the brother everyone talked about, the one who shared the spotlight with Waylon and Willie. For Chuck and Jim, who had toiled just as long and whose vocal contributions were equally essential to the group's signature sound, this must have been increasingly difficult to swallow. They weren't just background singers anymore, but they often felt relegated to supporting roles in the narrative being written about their own group. Resentment, quiet at first, began to simmer. They were the Glaser Brothers, plural, but the spotlight seemed determined to focus on just one. Compounding this was the complex issue of Hillbilly Central itself. While it was nominally owned by all three brothers, Tompall was its undisputed master, its creative director, its public face. He made the deals, he managed the sessions, he reaped the lion's share of the credit and potentially the financial rewards derived from its success as a studio and publishing house. Details from the era are murky, often clouded by conflicting accounts, but whispers began to circulate. Whispers that Chuck and Jim felt excluded from key decisions, that the financial arrangements weren't entirely transparent, that Tompall was leveraging the shared asset primarily for his own benefit and that of his outlaw friends. Whether these feelings were entirely justified or fueled by jealousy is hard to determine definitively, but the perception of inequity took root. Money, as it so often does, became a corrosive element, turning partnership into suspicion. Furthermore, the creative environment Tompall fostered at Hillbilly Central, one of freedom and experimentation for artists like Waylon, didn't always extend equally to his own brothers. Jim Glaser, in particular, was evolving rapidly as a songwriter. He was moving beyond the confines of traditional country harmony, exploring more personal, introspective themes, and developing a distinctive solo voice. He craved the opportunity to showcase this side of his artistry, to record his own songs, perhaps even pursue a solo career alongside the group. However, the Glaser Brothers' identity was built on their unique three-part harmony. Tompall, fiercely protective of the sound they had perfected, may have been resistant to deviations from the formula, intentionally or not. Creative differences, always present in any group, became more pronounced. Jim felt stifled, his individual ambitions clashing with the collective identity Tompall seemed determined to maintain. The studio that represented freedom for others began to feel like a cage for one of its owners. Tompall's personality, the same strong will and independent spirit that made him a leader and an outlaw, also made him notoriously difficult to work with, even for his own brothers. Accounts from the period describe him as volatile, opinionated, and fiercely controlling in the studio. What might have been perceived as confident leadership could easily bleed into autocratic behavior. The intuitive harmony they shared as children, the almost telepathic connection that defined their early sound, was being drowned out by arguments over arrangements, song choices, and business decisions. The easy camaraderie of the farm boys was fracturing under the pressures of fame and the complexities of running a musical empire. They were no longer just brothers singing together. They were business partners with diverging interests and growing grievances. The success of Wanted, the Outlaws in 1976, should have been their crowning achievement, a shared victory lap. Instead, it seems to have marked the beginning of the end. Tompall's prominent solo billing on the album, separate from his brothers, further highlighted the perceived imbalance. The very movement they had helped nurture was now, ironically, contributing to their internal dissolution. They had built a sanctuary for rebels, only to find that the rebellion had turned inward, pitting brother against brother. The harmony was fading fast, replaced by the discordant notes of resentment, mistrust, and wounded pride. The breaking point was near. The Glaser Brothers stood atop the country music world, icons of a revolution they helped ignite. Hillbilly Central was the buzzing, vital heart of outlaw country. But beneath the surface of success, the fraternal bonds that had carried them from Nebraska were fraying, strained by fame, money, and the dominance of one brother over the others. It was a pressure that would lead to their inevitable, heartbreaking collapse. We explore the final arguments, the bitter accusations, and the painful decision to dissolve the legendary trio. We follow their divergent paths after the split, the fleeting solo successes, and the enduring silence that replaced their once perfect harmony, a silence that would echo through the rest of their lives. They had built an empire from a dilapidated house on Music Row. By the mid-1970s, the Glaser Brothers stood atop the country music world, icons of the outlaw revolution they helped ignite. They were Grammy nominees, stars of the Grand Ole Opry, and their legendary studio, Hillbilly Central, buzzed as the crucible where revolutionary sounds were forged. Tompall was an undisputed kingpin, their publishing company a powerhouse. Individually and collectively, they had achieved fame, respect, and financial security beyond anything those Nebraska farm boys could have imagined. Yet paradoxically, the view from this glorious summit proved treacherous. The intense heat generated by their success began to warp the very structure holding them together. Resentment over Tompall's dominance, simmering disputes about finances and creative control at Hillbilly Central, and Jim's yearning for individual recognition festered beneath the surface. The perfect harmony, once their greatest strength, was dissolving into bitter discord, and the very success they had fought so hard for became the catalyst that would finally, irrevocably shatter their brotherhood. What followed was the inevitable heartbreaking collapse. The final arguments, the bitter accusations fueled by years of unspoken grievances, the painful decision to dissolve the legendary trio, and the divergent paths haunted by the enduring silence that replaced their once perfect harmony. These underlying tensions, Tompall's dominance, disputes over finances, and creative control at Hillbilly Central, and Jim's yearning for individual artistic expression did not dissipate with continued success. Instead, they festered, intensified by the constant pressures of touring, recording, and managing their increasingly complex business affairs. The easy camaraderie of their youth, the intuitive understanding that had defined their early harmony, was replaced by suspicion, resentment, and open conflict. The brothers who could once anticipate each other's musical moves now struggled to communicate, let alone collaborate. Tompall's shadow loomed larger than ever. His solo billing on the massively successful Wanted, the Outlaws album, while perhaps contractually justified given his individual contributions, served as a stark, public symbol of the internal hierarchy. He was the undisputed star, the brother who mingled easily with Waylon and Willie, the one the press wanted to talk to. This wasn't necessarily born of malice on Tompall's part. His personality was naturally commanding, his role in the outlaw movement genuinely significant. But perception is reality, especially within families. For Chuck and Jim, it felt like a constant validation of their secondary status. They were essential components of the Glaser sound, yet they increasingly felt like hired hands in Tompall's operation, particularly concerning Hillbilly Central. The studio itself, once a symbol of their shared independence, became a major source of contention. While legally a joint venture, it operated largely under Tompall's autocratic control. Decisions about who recorded there, the scheduling, the financial arrangements, particularly regarding publishing royalties generated through the studio, became points of friction. Chuck, with his quieter demeanor but keen business sense, likely felt sidelined in the management. Jim, focused more on the creative side, felt frustrated by the lack of resources or encouragement for his own burgeoning solo aspirations within their shared facility. Accusations, perhaps unspoken at first, then likely voiced in anger, began to fly. Accusations of mismanagement, of unfair distribution of profits, of Tompall prioritizing his outlaw buddies over his own brothers. The sanctuary they had built was becoming a battleground. Jim's artistic frustration reached a boiling point. He was writing prolifically, crafting songs that were more personal, more nuanced than much of the Glaser Brothers' established repertoire. He yearned to explore different musical textures, perhaps step away from the constant three-part harmony that, while their trademark, could also feel like a creative straitjacket. He reportedly pitched solo projects, ideas that were perhaps met with indifference or outright resistance from Tompall, who may have seen any deviation as a threat to the group's successful formula or his own authority. The dynamic was toxic. Jim felt creatively stifled. Chuck felt professionally marginalized. And Tompall, perhaps feeling the weight of leadership and the ingratitude of his brothers, grew more defensive and controlling. Accounts from musicians and engineers who worked at Hillbilly Central during this period often paint a picture of escalating tension. Recording sessions for the Glaser Brothers themselves reportedly became fraught affairs, marked by arguments over arrangements, vocal parts, and song choices. The intuitive magic was gone, replaced by negotiation and compromise, often punctuated by Tompall's explosive temper. The brothers, who had once harmonized effortlessly, now seemed to be singing from different song sheets entirely. Their public performances might have maintained a professional veneer, but backstage the cracks were widening into chasms. The final straws likely accumulated gradually, a particularly bitter argument over royalties, a rejected song, a perceived slight that tipped the scales. There wasn't necessarily one single dramatic blow-up, but rather a slow, painful erosion of trust and affection. By 1978, the situation had become untenable. The creative wellspring had run dry, replaced by acrimony. The business partnership was fraught with suspicion. Most tragically, the brotherly bond, stretched to its limit by years of unequal success and unresolved grievances, finally snapped. The decision to officially dissolve the Glaser Brothers trio was likely agonizing, the end of a musical journey that had spanned their entire adult lives, nearly 3 decades of singing side by side. It wasn't just the end of a band, it was the public admission of a family broken. The exact circumstances of the final split remained somewhat veiled, as the brothers themselves rarely spoke about it in detail publicly, preferring a wall of wounded silence. But the outcome was clear. The harmony was over. The country Beatles had broken up. the news sent ripples through Nashville. While perhaps not entirely surprising to industry insiders who had witnessed the growing tensions, it was still a somber moment. The Glaser Brothers were institutions, their harmonies woven into the fabric of country music. Their dissolution represented the end of an era, another casualty claimed by the volatile mix of fame, money, and ego that so often defines the music business. But for those who understood their deeper contribution, particularly through Hillbilly Central, the breakup signaled something more profound, the fracturing of one of the foundational pillars of the outlaw movement itself. The rebellion, it seemed, had begun to devour its own. In the immediate aftermath of the split, each brother embarked on his own path, attempting to navigate the musical landscape without the familiar anchor of the trio. Their journeys were markedly different, reflecting their individual personalities and the roles they had played within the group. Tompall, unsurprisingly, leaned fully into his established outlaw persona. He continued recording as a solo artist, already having tasted success with tracks like the controversial but popular novelty song Put Another Log on the Fire in 1975. Written by Shel Silverstein, the song, with its tongue-in-cheek lyrics about demanding wives, perfectly captured Tompall's rebellious, anti-establishment image. He continued to operate Hillbilly Central, though perhaps with less of the communal energy that had defined its heyday. The outlaw movement itself was evolving, becoming more mainstream, and the raw renegade spirit of the early 70s began to fade. Tompall remained a respected figure, a living link to that revolutionary period, but his solo career, while producing some strong work, never quite reached the commercial heights predicted for him. He seemed destined to be remembered more as a catalyst and a character than as a consistent solo star. His fierce independence, once his greatest asset, perhaps also contributed to a growing isolation within the changing Nashville landscape. He remained the outlaw, but the territory he roamed seemed to be shrinking. Jim Glaser, finally free from the constraints of the trio format, pursued the solo career he had long desired. Signing with the MCA Records, he set out to prove himself as an individual artist and songwriter. The journey wasn't easy. He had to overcome the industry's perception of him as simply one of the Glaser brothers and establish his own identity. His early solo efforts met with moderate success, but he persevered, honing his craft. His breakthrough finally came in the early 1980s. His smooth tenor voice found a perfect home in the contemporary country sound of the era. In 1983, his self-penned song, You're Getting to Me Again, became a major hit, reaching the coveted #1 spot on the Billboard country chart. He followed this with other successful singles like The Lights of Albuquerque and If I Could See the Lights of Home, solidifying his status as a legitimate solo star. He won the Academy of Country Music Award for Top New Male Vocalist in 1984, an award somewhat ironically named, given his decades of experience. Jim's success was a vindication, proof that his individual talent could shine outside the shadow of the group and his older brother. Yet, even at his peak, the legacy of the Glaser brothers remained an inescapable part of his narrative. Chuck Glaser, the middle brother, took a different route, perhaps less driven by the spotlight than Tompall or Jim, or perhaps simply recognizing the realities of his own performing strengths. Chuck largely transitioned to the business side of music. He remained involved in publishing, leveraging the considerable catalog the brothers had built through Glaser Publications. He also worked in production and artist management. His path was quieter, less public, but demonstrated a pragmatic understanding of the industry he had navigated for decades. While Tompall remained the renegade and Jim sought solo stardom, Chuck found a way to continue working within the Nashville system, albeit behind the scenes. It was perhaps his way of maintaining a connection to the music world without the inherent conflicts and pressures of performance. His choice represented a different kind of survival, a retreat from the battlefield where the family harmony had been lost. They had gone their separate ways, each achieving a measure of success or stability on his own terms. But the defining characteristic of the post-breakup era was the profound silence that descended between them. The brothers, who had once shared everything, cramped motel rooms, stage fright, the thrill of a hit record, the secrets only siblings know, now barely spoke. The acrimony of the split had left deep, festering wounds. Publicly, they maintained a degree of civility, rarely airing their dirty laundry. But privately, the bitterness ran deep. There were occasional tentative attempts at rapprochement over the years, often prompted by industry events or mutual acquaintances. Rumors of reunion tours or recording projects would surface periodically, sparking hope among fans who longed to hear that magical harmony once more. But these efforts invariably faltered. The underlying issues, the resentments, the financial disputes, the fundamental personality clashes had never truly been resolved. The hurt was too profound, the trust too broken. Tompall's stubborn pride, Jim's lingering sense of being undervalued, Chuck's quiet withdrawal, these stances, hardened over time, created barriers that proved insurmountable. They existed in the same city, often moved in the same professional circles, yet remained islands, separated by an ocean of unspoken words and unresolved pain. They might appear at the same award shows, perhaps nod politely from across the room, but the easy warmth, the shared jokes, the intuitive connection that had once defined them was gone. It was a tragedy played out not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, aching distance between three men who shared a name, a history, and a sound the world still remembered, even if they themselves could no longer find it together. Even in their individual endeavors, the ghost of the Glaser Brothers' harmony proved inescapable. Jim's solo hits were often praised for their vocal quality, but reviewers frequently noted the missing elements, the richness that only the three-part blend could provide. Tompall's outlaw credibility was forever linked to the Hillbilly Central era, an era defined by his initial collaboration with his brothers. Chuck's business dealings often involved managing the legacy, the publishing rights, of the music they had created together. They couldn't outrun their shared past. The harmony, even in its absence, continued to define them, a constant reminder of what they had achieved together and what they had ultimately lost. The success they found apart could never fully replicate the unique magic they had created as one. The silence between them was perhaps the loudest, saddest note of all. The harmony was broken, the brothers scattered. They had each found a way forward, but the path was solitary, forever shadowed by the memory of what they once shared. The immediate fallout of their split solidified their separate identities, but it also cemented the tragedy of their fractured brotherhood. This fractured legacy is where their story concludes. We journey through their later years exploring the enduring power of their music, juxtaposed against the persistent silence between them. We witness Tompall Glaser's final lonely days surrounded by the relics of his past, and ultimately, we reflect on the poignant, complex lessons their story offers about family, fame, and the fragile beauty of harmony, both musical and human. The years following the Glaser Brothers' split stretched into decades. The fiery outlaw rebellion they helped ignite cooled into mainstream acceptance, then evolved into new forms of country music. Nashville itself transformed, Music Row becoming a landscape of corporate headquarters and sleek studios, a far cry from the ramshackle beer-fueled creative chaos of Hillbilly Central's heyday. Trends came and went: urban cowboy, new traditionalism, the Garth Brooks Stadium era, the rise of Americana. Through it all, Tompall, Chuck, and Jim Glaser navigated their separate lives, their public presence diminishing, but their private story remaining a poignant undercurrent in the annals of country music history. The harmony was long gone, but the echoes, both musical and personal, lingered. Their individual careers continued, albeit with varying degrees of visibility. Jim Glaser enjoyed the most sustained solo success, maintaining a presence on the charts into the mid-1980s. His smooth voice and well-crafted songs found a niche, earning him continued respect within the industry. He became a fixture on the Grand Ole Opry as a solo artist, a testament to his enduring talent. Yet even during his peak years, the shadow of the trio remained. Interviews inevitably circled back to the glory days, the breakup, the possibility of reunion. He answered politely, professionally, but the careful avoidance of deeper issues spoke volumes. He had carved out his own space, but it was a space forever defined in part by the absence of his brothers. His success was real, but it felt like a melody played without its accompanying harmony parts. Beautiful perhaps, but incomplete. Tompall Glaser remained the enigmatic outlaw. He continued to record sporadically, releasing albums that often showcased his rugged individuality and disdain for Nashville conventions. Tracks like T for Texas or his interpretations of classic country and folk songs were reminders of his raw talent and unique phrasing. He maintained a devoted cult following, revered by those who remembered his pivotal role in the 70s revolution. However, mainstream country radio, increasingly dominated by slicker productions and younger artists, largely passed him by. Hillbilly Central, while still technically operational, lost its status as the movement's nerve center. Tompall seemed to retreat further into his own world, a figure respected for his past but increasingly disconnected from the present currents of the industry. Tales of his difficult personality persisted, perhaps contributing to his growing isolation. He was the architect who seemed content, or perhaps resigned, to dwell alone in the house he had built. His defiance, once a source of strength, may have become a wall separating him, not just from the industry, but from reconciliation. Chuck Glaser, ever the pragmatist, continued his work behind the scenes. He remained active in music publishing, managing the valuable Glaser song catalog, which included not only the brothers' hits, but also songs they had published for other writers during the Hillbilly Central era. He produced other artists, utilizing the deep industry knowledge he had accumulated over decades. His path was the least public, his name rarely appearing in headlines. Yet his steady hand on the business side ensured that the Glaser Brothers' musical legacy continued to generate income and remain accessible. It was a quieter contribution, perhaps, but essential. He was the custodian of their shared history, even as the personal connections remained severed. His role highlighted the strange dichotomy. The music they created together continued to be a viable business, even as the familial relationship that birthed it lay in ruins. But the true story of these later years wasn't written on the charts or in business ledgers. It was written in the silence, in the opportunities for reconciliation that came and went, unmet. As the brothers aged, entering their 50s, 60s, and 70s, the fierce anger of the initial breakup might have cooled, but it seemed to have been replaced by a hardened resignation, a deep-seated reluctance to revisit old wounds. Industry events, award ceremonies, Opry anniversaries, occasions that brought the Nashville community together would sometimes find all three brothers in the same room, perhaps even acknowledged from the stage, But observers noted the palpable distance, the lack of warmth, the careful avoidance. Polite nods replaced brotherly embraces. Small talk, if any, replaced the easy banter that had once characterized them. The wall between them, built brick by brick over years of misunderstanding and hurt, seemed impenetrable. Why? The reasons are likely as complex and multifaceted as any family feud. Pride certainly played a role, particularly for Tompall, who may have felt unjustly blamed or simply unwilling to compromise. Lingering financial disputes, never fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction, likely remained a barrier. Perhaps most profoundly, the sheer weight of unspoken words, the years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding created a chasm too wide to bridge. How do you begin to unravel decades of silence? Where do you even start? For the Glaser brothers, it seemed the effort, the emotional risk, was simply too great. It was easier, perhaps less painful, to maintain the distance. This persistent silence stands in stark, tragic contrast to the very essence of their musical gift. Their art was built on harmony, on the ability to listen intently to one another, to blend their individual voices into something unified and beautiful. Yet, in their personal lives, they had lost that ability entirely. The men who could create such intricate, intuitive musical conversations on stage and on record were unable or unwilling to have the difficult, necessary conversations off stage. It's the ultimate painful irony of their story. The music was about connection. Their lives became about disconnection. Fans, of course, never stopped hoping. The question of a Glaser Brothers reunion became a perennial topic in country music circles. The enduring popularity of their hits, the nostalgia for the Outlaw era, and the simple human desire to see a fractured family made whole fueled the speculation. Imagine the power, fans thought, of hearing those harmonies live one last time. But it was not to be. Unlike other groups who managed to overcome their differences for lucrative reunion tours, the Glasers remained resolutely apart. The damage, it seemed, was permanent. The harmony was lost not just to the stage, but to the brothers themselves. As the 21st century dawned, the brothers entered their twilight years. And it was the fate of Tompall, the eldest, the driving force, the outlaw icon, that provided the most poignant and perhaps most tragic final chapter. In his later years, Tompall became increasingly reclusive. He still lived in Nashville, surrounded by the ghosts of his past successes, but largely withdrew from the public eye. Reports surfaced of health problems, adding to his isolation. He passed away on August 13, 2013, at the age of 79 following a long illness. His death marked the definitive end of any possibility, however faint, of a Glaser Brothers reunion. The obituaries rightfully celebrated his immense contributions to country music, his powerful voice, his role in the outlaw movement, his fearless independence. They spoke of Hillbilly Central, of his collaborations with Waylon, of the indelible mark he left on the genre. But behind the official tributes lay a quieter, sadder reality. When Tompall died, he was reportedly found surrounded by the artifacts of his career, boxes upon boxes of reel-to-reel tapes, demos, unreleased recordings, memorabilia from decades past. It was as if he had retreated into his own personal archive, seeking solace or perhaps understanding within the recorded echoes of his own history. The image is haunting. The man who built a sanctuary for musical outcasts ultimately dying alone, his final companions the magnetic ghosts of harmonies past, including those shared with the brothers from whom he had become estranged. The tapes held the sound of their unity, a stark contrast to the silence that had defined their later years. Did he listen to them in his final days? Did he find peace or only regret? We can only speculate. But the image of Tompall Glaser, the defiant outlaw, ending his days amidst the dusty relics of a broken harmony, serves as a powerful, heartbreaking coda to the Glaser Brothers saga. He had fought the Nashville system and won, but seemed to have lost something far more precious in the process. Tompall's death left Chuck and Jim as the surviving keepers of the flame, and perhaps also the remaining bearers of the unresolved grief. While they continued their separate lives, his passing inevitably cast their own journeys in a new light. Did it offer a chance for closure, or simply underscore the permanence of the fracture? Publicly, they acknowledged their brother's passing with respectful sorrow, but the deep, personal reconciliation the world might have hoped for never materialized in the public eye. The silence, in many ways, endured. Jim Glaser continued performing, his voice still clear and strong, until his own passing in 2019. Chuck remained the quiet custodian of their business legacy. So, what is the ultimate legacy of the Glaser Brothers? Musically, it is immense and undeniable. Their unique harmony sound remains instantly recognizable, a benchmark of vocal excellence in country music. Countless artists, from traditionalists to alternative country acts, cite their influence. Their work as session singers graces some of the most iconic recordings of the 20th century, and their role, particularly Tompall's, in fostering the outlaw movement through Hillbilly Central, fundamentally altered the course of country music, injecting it with a shot of rebellious energy and artistic integrity whose effects are still felt today. They were architects of a sound and a movement. Without them, the landscape of modern country and Americana music would look very different. But their story transcends music. It serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of fame and fortune on family bonds. It reminds us that success in the public eye often comes at a steep private cost. The very drive and ambition that propelled them from Nebraska to Nashville, the strong personalities that allowed them to challenge the status quo, also contained the seeds of their conflict. Their inability to navigate the complex interplay of individual ambition and collective identity within a family unit led to their tragic unraveling. Their narrative also speaks to the complexities of brotherhood itself, the intense love, the fierce loyalty, but also the potential for deep-seated rivalries, misunderstandings, and hurts that can fester for a lifetime. The Glazers weren't villains. They were flawed human beings, caught in the unforgiving machinery of the music industry and the equally complex dynamics of their own family history. Their story resonates because it reflects universal truths about the fragility of human connection, even those bonds we assume are unbreakable. In the end, the story of the Glaser Brothers is a profoundly sad one, a country song lived out in real time. They were three voices that, together, created something magical, something far greater than the sum of its parts. They reached the pinnacle, changed the music world, and then lost their way, victims of the very success they had so desperately hid. They gave the world unforgettable harmonies, but ultimately couldn't find harmony amongst themselves. Tompall, Chuck, and Jim Glaser left behind a legacy etched in vinyl and woven into the very fabric of outlaw country. Their music endures, a testament to their extraordinary talent. But their story also leaves us with a lingering sense of sorrow, a haunting reminder of the high cost of broken bridges and unspoken words. They were the brothers who found the perfect harmony, only to watch it shatter into a silence that lasted a lifetime. And that, perhaps, is the saddest song they ever sang.